The golden orange days were becoming shorter, and saw Amadeus spending less time under the shade of the old oak tree's mighty branches. He watched the rusty brown leaves gently fall to the ground near his hooves. His shiny summer coat had been replaced by a much thicker one, and the whiskers on his chin were becoming more like the beard of a Spanish sailor. He could hear the sound of tiny feet scurrying through the leaf litter as the red squirrel busily collected acorns for his winter hoard. As quick as a flash, he bounded up the tree's thick bark when he spotted the buzzard floating overhead. The clear sky was now empty of the swifts, which only weeks ago had been catching insects above the field. They'd joined the swallows and house martins on their journey to far-off lands. The air was now filled with the sound of geese flying in formation as they gathered above the nearby estuary. Inside Amadeus's heart, there was an uneasy feeling of change, and the warm, optimistic days of spring, which offered so much new life and hope, seemed to be drifting further and further away, like the sound of the last ferry home fading into the distance. The robin redbreast swelled in size as he trapped air between his soft feathers and filled his tiny crop with as much food as possible in preparation for the cold months ahead. The landscape had become neatly trimmed, and the harvest had long been gathered and stored on the day Amadeus walked down to the water trough near the paddock gate. He could hear the distant sound of a church bell on the hill as water spilled from his soft lips and droplets ran down the whiskers of his chin. He wondered what it was like on the other side of the valley, beyond the now almost bare woodland which surrounded his field. The thought of another place in which to exist filled him with both intrigue and fear in equal measure. The field in which he was born was all he'd ever known. The time that he'd spent gazing at the stars with his mother as she told and retold him stories of his long-gone family who were watching over him from the heavens and would always guide him, seemed strangely recent, even though she too had gone to join him in the twinkling night sky. Each day he wandered down to the gate to drink from the trough, and the thought of what lay beyond became more and more prominent in his mind. The sound of the graveyard rookery on the hill and the weekly Sunday service was increasingly tantalizing as he felt the pull of intrigue. On a cold December morning, the hard frost crunched under Amadeus's hooves as he walked down to drink. But before he reached the trough, he could see that the field gate had been left open. He stood for a moment and snorted the icy air. He looked beyond the gate and then turned his head back towards everything he'd ever known. He looked again towards the open gate and took a few paces towards it. Nothing could stop him now if he wanted to go. With his heart beating loudly in his chest, he became aware of his legs skipping past the gatepost, and with ears pricked forward and tail held high, he boldly trotted into the unknown. In seconds, his huge black frame disappeared into the woodland, and the sound of his large hooves pounding the icy ground faded into the bushes as he melted into the scenery like the morning thaw. His paddock was now quiet and still. That was until the magpies started to chatter. Again and again they repeated their alarm calls from the bushes. The reason they were so upset was about to become apparent as the fox appeared from the woods along her well-trodden path. She was on her way back to her den after a night's hunting rabbits. She looked around the field and was surprised not to see Amadeus as usual. Amadeus had now wandered off quite some distance and had made his way to the stream at the bottom of the valley. He stopped for a drink in the cool, clear water. As he leaned down to take a drink, he could see a large brown trout swimming against the flow of the water in the shallows. The trout moved slightly downstream as Amadeus took several steps into the brook. The water tasted cold and clean as he drank deeply, until suddenly he heard a loud snap from the bank behind him, This startled Amadeus, and he bounded through the water until he reached the other side of the bank. When he looked around to see what had caused the noise, he saw that an old rotten branch had fallen from the tall tree on the opposite side of the stream. He realised that there was nothing to be scared of, and trotted off deeper into the woods. Meanwhile, back in his field, some of the other creatures had noticed that he'd gone missing and were looking for him. The robin redbreast, who always followed Amadeus around, sat in the old oak tree and looked out across the meadow for him. The squirrel took a moment from his very busy routine of collecting acorns and wondered where he'd gone. Even the buzzard noticed that the field seemed empty and bare without the presence of the big black horse that they all knew as their friend. After much walking through the woods, Amadeus finally ventured up the hill on the other side of the valley and approached the church. As he got closer, he was greeted by the loud sound of rooks who were wheeling around the bell tower. They seemed to move as one and resembled a black cape flowing in the wind. Amadeus walked through the graveyard and took a moment to feel the energy around him. The strong breeze blew through his long mane, which flowed like the rooks wheeling above him. He looked out across the valley, and for the first time in his life he could see the field and the barn in which he was born from a distance. It looked so small and insignificant, and he couldn't imagine that he'd never left before. From the top of the hill, Amadeus could see for miles. In every direction that he looked, there was another mystery to him. He took one last look at his field in the distance, then turned and cantered off into the first direction that his hooves carried him. As he sped off deeper into the woods, he noticed that all the trees were bent over in the same direction. The westerly wind had caused them to lean backwards from years of constant battering from winter storms. When he eventually stopped and took a mouthful of grass, he noticed that it tasted different to the grass that he was used to in his field. His field was south-facing and therefore got the sun all day long. Now he was in the opposite side of the valley, which spent much of the day in shade during the months when the sun was at its lowest. The grass was bitter by comparison. He noticed that the breeze had become much lighter, and the clouds, which had been building all day, looked like a white blanket in the sky. He noticed a small white feather floating before his eyes. He watched it as it danced around him before it finally settled on the end of his nose. Then he saw another, and another, and yet another. The feather felt cold and wet, and within a few seconds it turned into water right in front of him. Pretty soon there were feathers floating in every direction, except they were not feathers at all. It had started to snow and was getting thicker by the second. Amadeus trotted off further into the woods. There were no other animals or birds to be seen anywhere. The light started to fade, and the ground became slippery as the snow began to get thicker. Amadeus found that it was getting difficult to walk in the snow, so he found shelter under a large beech tree. All night the snow came down, and it got deeper and deeper. By morning the woods had become a winter wonderland. Thick snow had settled on every branch, and it was impossible to recognize anything. Amadeus's hoofprints had long been covered over by fresh snow. The air seemed eerily still and quiet. It was though he had cotton wool in his ears. Amadeus walked out from under the beech tree and looked around. He turned his head and looked behind him. Then he looked left, and then he looked right. He was lost and had no idea which way to go next. He called out with a loud whinny and listened. There was nothing. He walked on in the first direction that took his fancy. He called out again. All he heard was the echoing cronk-cronk of a raven as it sailed overhead and disappeared into the white sky. He sniffed the air, but it all seemed so alien to him. The grass had all been buried under the snow, and he felt hungry and tired. Back in his barn, the owl had fallen asleep on top of the wooden beams. She'd been keeping her eyes and ears out for Amadeus all night while she was hunting for mice. The barn and the field seemed empty without him, and all of his animal friends missed him. He walked on through the snow and looked for anything at all that could help him find his way back home. He saw a roe deer in the corner of his eye, but she skipped through a small gap in the bushes and vanished like a ghost before he had a chance to follow her. He wished he was back in his field, or better still, munching hay among the soft straw in the old barn. The cold and lonely day seemed to drag on, but pretty soon the light started to fade, and his second night of being lost in the woods started to creep across the sky. He found shelter under another large tree and closed his eyes while darkness took away any chance of him finding his way home. Several hours later he woke from his trance and looked above. He could see that the sky had cleared and the thick snow-filled clouds had been replaced by a freezing cold clear sky. The same sky that he remembered gazing at with his mother when he was just a foal. He remembered her words. The stars are spirits of everyone who has been before. They are looking down upon you and will always be there as your guide. There was one bright star in the sky that seemed to twinkle brighter than any other. He focused on it, and then, from somewhere deep within his heart, he heard his mother's voice.
Amadeus, don't worry, my child. Be calm. The signposts of nature are all around. You just have to know where to look for them. Remember to think with your heart.
Then another star seemed to shine brighter, and he heard one more familiar voice.
Amadeus, my son, remember what I told you. All the answers to all your questions can be found by looking inside your heart. Be brave. We are all here for you, and your friends are waiting. Now, go, Amadeus. Go home. The stars will guide you.
Amadeus followed the bright star which led him through the trees. All night he walked through the snow, and by morning he came to the edge of the woods. He noticed the trees bending backwards towards him. This meant that he must be heading west towards the prevailing wind. As he paused for a moment, he heard a familiar sound. Way off in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of the rookery on the hill. His heart started to beat faster in his chest, and he cantered in the direction of where the sound was coming from. Eventually he came to the stream. As he stopped, he looked into the clear water, and he could see the brown trout swimming against the flow of the brook. Except this time, it was swimming from left to right. He realized that he must be going in the right direction towards his home. He plunged into the water and bounded through it until he reached the other side of the bank. When he looked behind him, he noticed that the side of the stream where he'd just come from was in shade, but the woods ahead of him had sparkling rays of winter sunlight bursting through the branches. This made the snow-covered branches sparkle like a billion diamonds. With his heart beating loudly in his chest, Amadeus cantered on towards the light. No amount of snow could slow him down. As he reached the edge of the woods, he could see his field in the distance. His canter became a gallop, and with hooves pounding through the snow, he burst into his beloved paddock, leaving a trail of powder behind him. He thundered across the field and didn't slow down until he reached the old barn. Suddenly, he screeched to a halt as he approached the barn door. What was the sound he heard echoing across the valley? It was the sound of bells coming from the old church on the hill, for this was Christmas morning, and as he walked into the barn, all his friends were waiting for him. The red squirrel dashed up onto the stone wall with excitement. The robin redbreast flitted from the straw bale to the window ledge, and the barn owl looked down from the wooden beams and gave an excited screech. Amadeus was so pleased to be back in his wonderful old barn, and he spent the rest of the day eating lovely hay and getting warm and cosy on his bed made of clean straw. He stayed in the barn all day, but that night he walked out and looked up at the stars again. They were brighter than ever. He had the best Christmas present of all. He had his friends, and he knew, deep down in his soul, that he was loved and always will be.